right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello and good evening. Welcome along to Neil Oliver Live on GB News, TV and on radio. Tonight we'll cover the effect First Minister Paul Given's resignation has had on institutional abuse survivors in Northern Ireland, and how effective were lockdowns in trying to reduce COVID mortality rates. Plus, we'll be speaking to Jeff Hoon, the former Defence Secretary, Transport Secretary, Leader of the House of Commons and Government Chief Whip. All of that and more coming up. But first, an update on the latest news from Tamsin Roberts.
Neil, thank you. Good evening from the GB newsroom. The Prime Minister has announced 2 new appointments to Downing Street after a wave of resignations this week. Cabinet Minister Steve Barclay is to become Boris Johnson's Chief of Staff, saying it's an honour to have been asked. Gitto Harry, who was an advisor to Mr Johnson when he was Mayor of London, will become Director of Communications. The Prime Minister says the changes will strengthen his cabinet and accelerate his mission to level up the country. Meanwhile, a former minister has become the latest PM to submit a letter of no confidence to Boris Johnson. Nick Gibb, who was Schools Minister last year, has joined a number of fellow Conservatives calling on the Prime Minister to resign. It's reported up to 17 MPs have now submitted letters, but a total of 54 are needed to trigger a vote of no confidence. Conservative MP for Thirsk and Malton, Kevin Hollinrake, told GB News the Prime Minister is still popular.
There's a lot of support for Boris Johnson out there. I mean, it's different in Westminster and it's different in the media, of course. I do not think we should have a Prime Minister removed from office in this country because of a media lynch mob. I think we need to go through this process properly. I think we need to see the results of the inquiry and the investigations and make a proper decision from there.
The Duke of York is due to give evidence under oath next month as part of the ongoing civil sex assault case against him. Prince Andrew will face what is known as a deposition in London in what has been described as a neutral location. Virginia Giuffre, the Duke's accuser in the case, claims he sexually assaulted her when she was 17. The Duke strenuously denies all allegations. Boris Johnson has spoken with the French president over the tensions on the Ukraine border. Downing Street said the Prime Minister and Emmanuel Macron both agreed a diplomatic solution remains the overriding priority. The French leader will visit Moscow next week to hold discussions with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. The planned visit comes as China backed the Kremlin's demand that NATO does not allow Ukraine to join the military alliance. A new competition has been launched by the government to find the new home of the railways. The winning town or city, which has to be outside London, will house the new Great British Railways headquarters. Transport Secretary Grant Shapps says it should be somewhere well connected and with a great railway history, and the winner will be announced this summer. And the Queen has hosted a reception in Sandringham for members of the local community as part of celebrations to mark her Platinum Jubilee. The 95-year-old monarch welcomed guests, including former cookery student Angela Wood, who helped invent the famous dish Coronation Chicken. It was served to guests after the Queen's coronation in 1953. And today, Her Majesty also cut a sponge cake decorated with the Platinum Jubilee logo. This is GB News on TV, online and DAB+ radio. We'll bring you more news as we get it. Now, though, it's back to Neil Oliver Live.
We ought to be looking at the pandemic in the rearview mirror now. It should be behind us. It should be over. We should be in the post-mortem phase, asking what happened, how on earth we allowed governments to ride roughshod over our rights. We should be hearing apologies from our elected representatives. But no. Somehow COVID still manages to be in our faces, suffocating us bit by bit and all the time. My children are still required to wear masks at school, all day, every day, rebreathing their own exhaust fumes for hours at a time. In Scotland last week, First Minister Nicola Sturgeon said her devolved assembly would spend hundreds of thousands of taxpayers' pounds cutting the bottoms off classroom doors so as to improve airflow in schools. Seriously, that's what she said. Get this, she actually said there's a worry about how much CO2 children are inhaling in improperly ventilated classrooms. They have to keep the masks on so that they exist in a permanent cloud of their own self-generated CO2 held over their mouths and noses like a smothering hand. But rather than let them take off those masks and breathe air like free people should, Sturgeon's proposed solution is to take a saw to the bottom of the classroom doors. To say you couldn't make it up is an insult to made-up things. The fact that you can open a door to increase ventilation on account of its having hinges, the fact that doors exist in schools, at least in part, to inhibit the spread of smoke and flames in the event of fire, significantly more of a threat to the lives of children and staff than COVID ever was, has apparently passed Sturgeon by. But hey-ho, if there's one thing we've learned after 2 years, it's that everything is all and only about COVID. Some days it feels like it always will be. COVID could and should be behind us, as I've already said, but the powers that be keep pulling it back around until it's front and centre. Johnson announced some sort of an end to restrictions, but still that air of lives limited, lives controlled prevails, like the smirking grin that remains after the Cheshire Cat has otherwise disappeared. And you want to know why? Because after these 2 years, like no others in our history, COVID is all they've got to explain and to justify everything else. Governments need COVID, and desperately. They spent, I think I've got my thumbs right, about £1 gazillion on COVID, all the money we ever had and most of the money we might ever dream of having. They blew the lot on COVID. And since COVID is all the governments have got now, by God they're determined to keep it. COVID, as it turns out, is like a sort of Swiss Army knife, equipped with all sorts of useful little tools for all sorts of jobs, large and small. And meanwhile, the evidence of man-made disaster is all around us. A recently published study from the world-renowned Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore found lockdowns had had little to zero public health benefits and instead imposed enormous economic and social costs. Like we didn't know that already, having been there while it was actually happening. But anyway, let's hear it again. Researchers found lockdowns in Europe and the US lessened the COVID-19 mortality rate by just 0.2%. The authors concluded that lockdown policies are ill-founded and should be rejected in future. Everywhere they were applied, everywhere, lockdowns caused enormous economic and social costs. Allow me to summarise those findings even more. Our governments blew it. Faced with what they told us was the greatest threat to our civilization in our lifetimes, for 100 years or more, our governments took a bad thing and, through overconfidence, monumental incompetence, and with the dull-eyed stubbornness of mules, made it massively worse. More importantly, when they must have known they were making it worse, they did it again and again. Now, rather than take responsibility and own up to their catastrophic failures, maybe say sorry for all the lives ended, lives ruined, lives compromised, a generation of children used like sandbags to protect the vulnerable from a flood, like stab vests worn on the chests of adults. They keep holding up the tattered rags of COVID like the remnants of a curtain to stop us seeing the reality that lies behind it. What lies behind that shabby curtain are consequences, and even now those powers that be don't want us looking at them, far less talking about them, and thereby understanding the crippling reality of them. For one thing, the currencies, and indeed the entire financial model of the West, these have to be bleeding out, turning white prior to falling over completely, I suspect, and lying face first in the dust. It's hardly just COVID to blame for that, of course. COVID was a final nail in the coffin, or some might say a very useful distraction, to say the least. What they did with money, your money, my money, everybody's money during the pandemic is what the banks have been doing with money for decades now, and it's largely to blame for the bigger mess we're in now. Quantitative easing, they called it, printing money to you and me. For decades, the tactic applied by the banks with governments in cahoots was to print uncountable, unthinkable amounts of money. We don't have any money left. Well, print more then. How much? As much as you like, and keep it coming. I need another super yacht, and so does my mum. No one will notice, and if they do, say it was COVID. Imagine a glass of orange squash, a little bit of concentrate topped up with water. Tastes like orange, you know how it goes. Then imagine tipping that glassful into an empty swimming pool and turning on the taps. By the time the pool is filled up with water, any orange in the mix is so diluted as to be utterly undetectable. That, more or less, is what's happened to our money. The value of our money has been so diluted it's quite literally not worth the paper it's printed on, which probably explains why they don't seem to want to actually print it on paper anymore. They just add more zeros on their computer screens instead. Look at what they did with some of that pretend money. Trillions of pounds worth of debt that will never, ever be repaid. Billions blown on dodgy PPE. Billions handed over as bounce-back loans to companies that didn't even exist. Gone. Those gazillions are gone. And the truly troubling point is that in every way that matters, they didn't really exist in the first place. Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson and the like have the gall to say they've got a way to fix the mess. They might as well try to put out a factory fire by blowing on it. On account of all that funny money, and then their use of COVID as a hammer to flatten business after business, the economic and financial model we've taken for granted for the last 50 years or more is finally done. That Sunak and others claim it's still breathing puts me in mind of Monty Python's Dead Parrot sketch. I took the liberty of examining that economy when I got it home, and I discovered the only reason that it had been sitting on its perch in the first place was that it had been nailed there. It's stiff, bereft of life, kicked the bucket, run down the curtain and joined the bleeding choir invisible. This, as Monty Python might have said, is an ex-economy. Much of Europe is an interesting watch, to say the least. Austria is a police state now in all but name, thanks to COVID. Papers, please. Italy and Germany are much the same. France would likely go the same way, except President Macron is too properly scared of too many of his own people to go all the way to vaccine mandates. Instead, he remains committed to making the lives of the unvaccinated as miserable as possible. In Western Australia, unvaccinated parents are barred from the hospitals where their children lie sick, dying. In Canada, the GoFundMe organisation has withheld millions of dollars raised in good faith in support of the truckers protesting vaccine mandates. What will become of that money, donated by hundreds of thousands of ordinary Canadians, remains unclear. More and more questions are being asked about the vaccines. All around the world, questions about efficacy, about safety, and yet governments like the US, Canada and Australia, as well as here and just about everywhere else, continue to dig in, more and more determined to get a needle into every arm on the planet. Israel is beavering away with injection number 4, and the positive cases are spiking in what looks on the graphs like a vertical line pointed into space. With the COVID narrative in tatters now, new weapons of mass distraction are being deployed to stop us thinking too much about the mess. There was a GP on the telly last week saying the stress of lockdown is causing heart attacks and strokes. Well, I never. Climate crisis and environmental meltdown are back to the fore again. Never mind the fact we've dumped trillions of filthy face masks and plastic COVID tests into that environment. That doesn't seem to matter. Millions of Britons face a cost of living crisis, energy prices soaring, thanks in no small part to successive governments' evangelical pursuit of net zero. I'd like to say don't mention the war, but of course there's Russia and Ukraine to look forward to as well. At least there's the lovely, lovely Olympics in China, thanks to dear old Xi Jinping, who kindly made all the masks and PPE. Shh, don't mention the Uyghurs, and definitely don't mention the lab in China, where, according to more and more scientists, at least the virus started. And before anyone says all lives matter, let's remember to forget about the uncounted thousands of Africans and others treated no better than slaves who died building the stadiums for the World Cup in Qatar that our fittest and finest are heading to. Quick, somebody talk about COVID. Weapons of mass destruction or not, there will be no hiding the fuel bills due in a few weeks' time. People forced to choose between eating and heating tend to behave differently than before. Energy black hole, net zero and its consequences, and only pretend money with which to pay for it all. How much longer can our dear leaders hide behind COVID? We do a lot of weather forecasting on this channel. I tell you this, there's a storm coming. Now, all of that is my opinion, of course, and we like to hear from everyone on this show, so you can email me and you can tell me what you think on gbviews@gbnews.uk, and you can tweet us as well @gbnews. I'll read out some of your comments a little later in the show. To help me along through the next 2 hours here on GB News, on TV and on digital radio, my wonderful panel. Tonight, Benjamin Loughnane, Research Fellow at the Bow Group, and also joining me is Arlene Foster, former First Minister of Northern Ireland and GB News presenter. Thank you both. Thank you for making the time for me this evening. Arlene, is it time to say COVID is over? And are we due some apologies from those that led us?
Well, I was one of the persons that led, of course, in Northern Ireland at the time. And I've been thinking a lot about that time when we were getting all of that advice right back at the start of COVID, and how much we were afraid as leaders at that time, because we were being told that thousands of people were going to die from COVID unless we acted. And we were taking all of that, of course, in good faith. We were looking at the modelling that was being given to us as leaders. And being in devolved administrations, we were, of course, speaking to the Westminster government about what was going on at that time as well. So I think there has to be a lot of reflection as to what happened at that time, because really we have to learn from this period of time.
The fear was understandable at the beginning.
It was.
But it was the way it was sustained.
Yeah.
It became apparent to many, many people long ago that there was another way of looking at it and another way of interpreting it, and that was simply flattened. And it was lockdown, lockdown, lockdown.
It was, and when we tried to have a discussion in the Northern Ireland Executive about proportionality, because all of our actions were meant to, under the law, be proportionate to the risk and to the threat. When you tried to have that conversation, then the people who were having that conversation and who were trying to balance up other healthcare issues, isolation, our older people being left on their own for long periods of time, our young people not being able to socialise and to have that peer experience. I mean, my children were meant to be at university but were at home, etc., etc. When you tried to have that conversation as well as the economic harm that was going on, then you were labelled as someone who didn't care about the health of the population.
Yeah.
It was a terrible time, Neil, and I hope that when people look back at that, they realise that actually we weren't taking into account all of the other harms that were going on at that time, and we should have been. We tried to.
Benjamin, why do you think that was? As Arlene says, there was no room for anything else. It was just COVID, and everything was justified by COVID, even when the evidence began to look at least as though it could be interpreted more than one way.
I was one of those people who from the very beginning had the view that it was all an overreaction and that a lot of the measures being taken were sort of disproportionate and unfair and had so many adverse reactions in other areas that they were effectively Pyrrhic in the approach. You were losing more than you gained, as it were. But I understand that when you're in a position of leadership and when you have that sort of myopic approach to governance where people are constantly presenting you with data and the data is always focused on one particular issue in one particular way, it's very hard to see beyond that. You sort of lose your peripheral vision. and you start to make decisions based on what the threat is that's being presented to you constantly, and it's not always easy. And I think it would do to have a degree of charity towards our leaders to say that at the beginning they might have got it wrong. The problem was when it got compounded, when after a certain amount of time, a lot of people had made that point. They'd said, you know, these decisions you're making are very harmful. My business is closed, my family are suffering, I'm losing money, I'm struggling, people are dying, people are committing suicide due to this. At that point, it would have been good for them to turn around and say, OK, this policy might be wrong, maybe we should rethink it, or at least take into account the other harms, the economic, the social, the psychological, but they didn't, and that's the issue.
Why didn't that happen, Arlene? We're all agreed that my wife and I, we watched the television, we saw the pictures in China and Italy and all the rest of it, and what on earth is going on here? And it did seem appropriate to take a pause of a few weeks maybe and have a look at what was going on.
Yeah.
It was the sustained, mulish perseverance with a set of policies that they could see were causing more harm.
Well, when you're in, obviously Northern Ireland's slightly different because you're in a mandatory coalition and you've everybody there from the extreme left to the centre right, and I'm in the centre right, of course, and I think the left will always want to have power, if you like, over their citizens. And I mean, people actually got to the stage where they were asking us, can we do this? Can we do that? I mean, people, their own lives, they were asking politicians, can I do X, Y, and Z? It was a bizarre time. And we've seen in Scotland, Neil, now that Nicola Sturgeon wants to retain some of those emergency powers, which I think is completely wrong. The power to close schools at will, the power to have courts not held in person. So some really fundamental freedoms are going to be kept in Scotland by the government.
And do you agree with me that COVID has happened, and let's say at some point it has to be behind us. The financial, the monetary consequences, that if they're obvious to me, and I'm amongst the many things I have to declare that I'm not an economist.
Yeah.
But locking down for months on end, shutting businesses, you thought, who's paying for this? Well, where do you think we are in terms of the currency, the financial model? You know, as I was pointing out, where do you think we are? Well, are we being nudged towards something different?
Well, the macroeconomics is one thing, but the microeconomics, the actual individual businesses that went out of business, for me, that was the cruelest point, because we were saying to people, we're closing down your business, we're giving you some money to help you get through, but those people couldn't survive. And therefore, then that went into other health damage, mental health damage, people taking their own lives because they felt they were letting their families down and not able to keep their businesses running. So there is, of course, the macroeconomic piece, which we're now feeling in terms of the inflation that we're having, in terms of us although the growth piece seems to be going well, Neil, I have to say, and that's good to see. But it begs the question, where would we have been, actually, if there hadn't been this interruption to what has happened to the economy?
And where are we with our currencies, with the financial model, with this sustained quantitative easing?
One of the issues is when you see all these economic predictions and announcements. For example, in America the other day, they said it's the biggest year in history in America for job growth. 6.6 million jobs created in 1 year. It's like, well, when people had to lay people off for 2 years, when those jobs were destroyed for 2 years, of course, when they come back, it's going to be the biggest ever year. But if you track what the growth would have been without that, of course, we have suffered. Everyone's suffered. I think one of the reasons, to go back to the original point that we were making, why people didn't exit when they realised that the decisions that were being made were wrong, is because no one wanted to be the first person to row back on it. No one wanted to be the person who took the risk to say, actually, this isn't quite as severe as we thought, and there are other factors, and we need to take those into considerations, reopen the businesses, get life back into running. And I think Peter Hitchens made a very good point about this recently. He said it's like 10 Downing Street. There was a time during the IRA bombings when they put the fences up outside 10 Downing Street, and he said no one will ever take that fence down. Because the moment someone takes that fence down and a terrorist attack happens, they'll be pointed to and said, you're the person who said to take that fence down. And he said, once you introduce something, a restriction or a law or a fence of any kind, it's very difficult to remove it. And so you need to think twice about things like lockdown. You can't act sort of impulsively. You can't have knee-jerk reactions and say we're going to put these restrictions in place unless you know you've got an exit strategy if things aren't quite as bad as you think they might be.
We can pick all of this up as the show goes on. We're looking at lockdowns and other effects of COVID later in the show. Break coming up. After the break, we'll discuss the effect First Minister Paul Given's resignation has had on institutional abuse survivors in Northern Ireland.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back. The desperately upsetting story of the historic abuse of children in residential institutions run by religious, charitable and state organisations in Northern Ireland ought never to be forgotten. That said, surviving victims of the abuse, known to have been committed since at least the time of the foundation of Northern Ireland itself, are still awaiting a public apology from the state. The apology had been scheduled for March the 11th and would have been offered by First Minister Paul Given and Deputy First Minister Michelle O'Neill more than 5 years after a landmark report revealed the extent of the abuse. But the recent resignation of Mr Given in the face of the ongoing dispute about the Northern Ireland Protocol has cast doubt about whether the apology will now take place as scheduled. Joining me now to talk about the abuse and the long-running campaign for the recognition and compensation of victims is Margaret McGuckin from Survivors and Victims of Institutional Abuse. Good evening, Margaret. Thank you for making time for me.
Not at all. Thanks for having me, Neil. Thank you.
Could you tell us, first of all, what is the latest information that you have about when and if this apology will happen?
Well, we're very uncertain what's going to happen. We heard Jeffrey, and thank God, I heard him say that in behind the scenes they were talking to ministers that maybe ministers could take over because the First and Deputy First Minister are no longer in place. And when there is no government, the head of the civil service has to step in and take over business. But I know it would be more meaningful for ministers to deliver the apology, but I believe it is more. It would be more forthcoming for the First and Deputy First Minister to be in place. But if that's not going to happen, victims cannot wait till after the election, and then they may not get back together again. So how far down the road will that be kicked again? We have waited a long time for this apology. I started this process in 2008, Neil. 2008. And this is going into the 15th year. You know, we all need a break from it all. It's been one fight after another, as Arlene is aware. You know, the government collapsed as well. We have had one door closed in our face after another. You know all about the legislation. We had to fight for that. We were the only piece of legislation that got through Westminster. And thanks to Julian Smith for that as well. We trailblazed that, and he finished it.
You mentioned the survivors, not having time. What age are some of the people that you're representing, and what what condition are they in? What are they unwell?
No, not very unwell. There's not too many left because the majority of people who were in these homes had a very short lifespan because of their mental health issues. The oldest that we have there's a few in their 80s, and they're still hanging on by a thread, just for someone to say sorry. My own brother is in a care home because of his rape and physical and mental torture as a young child and a young teenager in the notorious Steel Asal run Raban House, Kirkcobin home. And when he got out of that, nobody could understand why he was screaming into himself. They diagnosed him as having schizophrenia and threw him into Muckamore. Now, that is another notorious place that there's an inquiry into as well. Instead of trying to find out what's wrong with him, he carried so much shame and blame and blamed himself. And this is why this apology would be very meaningful to him. I visited him 2 weeks ago and told him, the government are going to say sorry to you, Kevin. And he smiled broadly, and he said, Margaret, it wasn't my fault. And I said, I know, he's the mind of a 14-year-old because his growth stunted, because he held all that shame. There's so many people, Neil, there didn't want the compensation, like we Kate Wandridge, that Arlene knows Kate. She said, it's too late for money for me. My life was already ruined, but I just want somebody to say, it wasn't your fault. It was ours, and we are taking responsibility for that.
Arlene, when you listen to that, it's heart-rending testimony. What should happen?
Well, we've worked with Margaret, and I have to say the heart inquiry that was set up to deal with this horrific stain on the state's past had two functions. It was a statutory inquiry, but it also allowed the victims to come along and to tell their story as to what had happened to them. And some of that was very harrowing, but we felt it was the right thing to do, and the government felt it was the right thing to do. And then after the Heart Inquiry report came forward, it made a number of recommendations. And Margaret has already referenced the redress board and the compensation that is now in place. There's now a commissioner there for the survivors of institutional abuse who works with the victims. But there's two outstanding things left. One is the apology and one is a memorial. And the apology is not just from government, as I understand it, it's also from representatives of the institutions where this abuse took place. And I think that is very important as well.
Yes.
Does it send the message? It seems agonisingly ironic that people who were, in a sense, overlooked and disregarded as children, and now after all of this has come out and they've made their testimonies and it's all on the record, and what is being waited for is an apology from the state, that for want of a political solution about something else, they're being disregarded again. It's a desperately upsetting message to send to vulnerable people.
And it will have been very upsetting for a lot of victims when they have the date set for the apology, which I know Margaret and a lot of victims have been waiting for an awfully long time, that this is what has happened. And that's why Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, the leader of the DUP, as Margaret has said yesterday, that he hoped that another minister could deliver the apology on behalf of the Northern Ireland Executive. And I think that is the answer to this, because then that would allow the apology to happen from the Executive, and then also the other institutions could make their apologies as well. And I think it is important that people like Margaret's brother know that it wasn't their fault and that they were let down and abused by the institutions that are going to make that apology.
Benjamin,
Arlene, we were hoping, Arlene, that maybe it would be more than one minister. You know, that it would be all the available ministers together standing in a line, along with those from the institutions. So I think that would look better than the one.
Yeah,
you know,
I think
that we can get round
right.
to.
Yeah, I think that's right, Margaret. Actually, a minister from each of the parties, as it were. So yeah, that would certainly make sense.
And if Paul and Michelle entered in as MLAs, just you know, surely could they not? You know, would that look a lot better? You know, wouldn't it? I think, and hopefully everybody behind the scenes can work together and just show some compassion and use discretion and get it done. You know, Arlene, you know how long I've been fighting here, and the weight on my shoulders. You know, when I wake up, when I heard that news, and it was like you're non-stop media and running and answering the phone and you know, the energy that it takes. You know what I mean? I need a rest too, if that's not being selfish. But, you know, I do give me all. And, you know, and this is a cross-community effort. And I've made so many special friends for my White Abbey, right, Rathgale folk. You know, and this is the Shankill and the Falls and Newton Ards, Bangor, you know, and we're such a wee close family, you know, rather than our own family. Many of us were separated from our own siblings. And we've made that bond between us. You know, we've done more for the cross-community effort than perhaps a lot of people out there. And we have a special bond, and we maintain that amongst ourselves, you know. And they're crying out for this apology too, you know. So I just hope and pray, you know, that they do get together and work on this just to let this suffering end, you know, and let us have some sort of life, you know, for what's left of it, for many of us.
Benjamin, it's quite something to listen to that, isn't it? And that after all that these people have been through, that all that's being asked is an apology. Yeah. You know, lives of generations of people so damaged, if not downright destroyed, and all that's being requested is an apology, and the apology still won't come.
I think that's why it's so important that this doesn't come from a civil servant or from a junior minister. It needs to come from the top of government, because it's not just an apology, it's a promise that it won't happen again. And that promise means nothing if it doesn't come from the right place. It needs to come from someone who has the authority, but also the responsibility going forward, leading the government to say, I am bearing the responsibility on my shoulders that this will not happen again whilst I'm in office. And I think that's why it's so important that it doesn't get palmed off to effectively a bureaucratic process, an official apology that goes through whoever happens to be leading the government at any given time. It needs to come from someone who's saying, I'm leading the country, I'm leading these people, and I'm saying, this will not happen again. That's why it's important, I think.
Margaret, it's profoundly moving listening to you describe your brother, that he keeps saying after all this time that it wasn't his fault. You know, that's even more than wanting that's even less, in a sense, than wanting an apology. That he, after all this time, he just wants an acknowledgement that it wasn't his fault, as though it could ever have been his fault. And that he is still living with that need is so deeply affecting.
Yeah, and that's in the minds of a lot of our people, we Kate and all. And, you know, I didn't have a good life myself leading up to the start of the inquiry. I used to hate myself and, you know, get into all sorts of trouble, and I was so angry because it was ingrained into me that I was the most horriblest person, that I was evil. It left me that I was just full of sin because the religious orders told me this, you know, the spawn of the devil. And that's the language that they used, you know, and I hated myself, and I used to cover up myself, you know, and look into the wall and hide from people or fight out against people so they wouldn't hurt me again. So it leaves you destroyed, you know. And so this is why we want to see the institutions up here, the Sisters of Nazareth and the De La Salle Order and Bernardo's and the Department of Health who ran them and Justice. And that's why all them ministers should be there early, you know, who ran Rathgale and you know, and White Abbey and Kincora, you know, because that was involved in our inquiry as well. You know, we want to see them all and us standing there, and that will help us to straighten up and have a smile on our face. It's too late for too many people that I was in the home with are all dead. They drank themselves to death or mental health issues. You know, everybody has issues here. You know, and to see that on that day and to be televised all over the world, that would be so special for us all.
Margaret, you make your point so effectively and you speak so movingly, and I can't thank you enough for making the time for us this evening. And I can only continue to wish that you and the rest that you represent get that satisfaction, that apology that's so desperately required. So many thanks for now, Margaret.
Thank you.
And good luck with it.
Anytime.
Thank you. Arlene, it goes to something very profound, doesn't it?
Yeah.
About humanity and about who we are as a society. That you've got people representing at least a century of mistreatment and abuse.
Yeah.
And even after all this time, all they're asking for, the remnants that are left, is to be told it wasn't their fault by someone in authority.
And you know, it really makes you look at I'm a Christian, I'm a person of faith, and when you look back at what was happening in homes run by religious orders, it really was awful. We actually did another piece of work after the institutional abuse report. We did a piece of work on institutions called mother and baby homes. So in other words, if a woman got pregnant and she was young or unmarried in the 40s and 50s, she was spirited away to a mother and baby home, would have her baby there, and the baby was then taken off her and adopted. And there's some suggestion that the adoptions happened across the border and then there was a complete loss of contact. I mean, I've listened to some stories that are just horrific. You know, people looking for their birth mothers. There's a gentleman who was looking for his birth mother and he eventually found her in England, and regrettably she'd just died shortly before he found out where she was. So there's some horrific stories that went on then, and those were run by religious orders. So, you know, we do have to look at what happened in our past in the name of religion. It is a terrible, I've said it before, it's a terrible stain on society that sort of abuse took place.
It is, Benjamin, isn't it, that reminder that the stories that you're hearing from are of people who were vulnerable in any event.
Yeah.
For all manner of reasons, they were already vulnerable.
Yeah.
And that they were exploited. And it's the haunting thought that, you know, I think we all know that something similar will still be going on somewhere.
Yeah.
You know, that it never stops. And that's why we have to remember and remind ourselves all the time about what happened in the past, because you can guarantee it's happening now.
Indeed, and I think people who do these things in the name of religion, or they use religious institutions, which are of course high trust, there's a lot of trust put into these institutions, they do it deliberately. Because people who are predatory find positions of trust in order to exploit that trust. Mm-hmm. And that's why you see, it's not because religion is bad, it's not because religious institutions are bad, it's because bad people are attracted to those sorts of things because it gives them a degree of trust and respect. Yeah. Where people think they're unimpeachable, they couldn't possibly be doing that sort of thing because they're part of this order, they're part of that order. And it gives them a sort of a veneer of respectability which allows them to do what they do. The other problem is, of course, the old saying, hurt people, hurt people. A lot of the time you see it's a cycle. A lot of the time when you see these things occurring, it's people who abused themselves when they were young. It's one of the issues which is very hard to grapple with because you need to stop that chain at some point. And a lot of people, I think, it's too sensitive, it's too caustic an issue to properly grapple and deal with. And so a lot of people, it's easier to ignore it. And when you ignore it, it continues.
So painful and so important to hear from someone like Margaret there, and the way that she was expressing that and speaking from the heart about personal, you know, that's personal testimony, which is, you know, it's golden, I think, when it comes to, you know, getting a message across. And it's so important, I think, to make time to hear those stories, just to hear the stories. After the break, should the Hadrian's Wall Trail include Newcastle's West End?
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello again. Now, Hadrian's Wall is 1,900 years old this year. Many happy returns there. Generally regarded as the most extravagant boundary in the Roman world, the wall, begun on the instructions of Emperor Hadrian in 122 AD, stretches 73 miles from Wallsend on the River Tyne in the east to Bowness on Solway in the west. It drew a line between the Roman province of Britannia in the south and Wild Caledonia in the north. The Hadrian's Wall path or trail leads walkers along the length of the wall, but this year campaigners are hoping the route may be tweaked to take in a hitherto overlooked section of the boundary in Newcastle. Chi Onwurah, Labour MP for Newcastle upon Tyne Central, says it's high time the wall's remains in Newcastle's West End were brought to greater attention. I think I agree. And that a year-long celebration of the wall in this, its 1,900th year, is the perfect opportunity to right an old wrong. And Chi joins me now. Hello.
Hi, hello.
What are we missing out on as visitors to Hadrian's Wall by not seeing this hitherto overlooked section?
Well, the fact is that you're not actually following the wall. I mean, you know, Hadrian's Wall, as you said, it's like it was the boundary, it was the frontier of Roman Britain. And it started at Wallsend, which is where I was born, if you like, and went over to Carlisle. And of course, it went through Newcastle. But what the trail does is to take walkers away from the actual wall. Hadrian's Wall Trail does not follow the wall, takes walkers away from it and takes them down to the Tyne River, which is beautiful, etc., and we love that. But you actually miss some of the most important remnants of the wall and very visible ones. So, say in Benwell and Scotswood, which is in the West End of my constituency, then there was a really thriving Roman fort, and you can see the remnants of that there. There was also a temple to the god, the Roman god that was only worshipped actually locally, but it was worshipped by Romans and, if you like, early Geordies alike, and it's the temple, and I always have difficulty pronouncing this, but it's the temple of Atenositicus. There's a temple there. You miss out on that, and you miss out on all. You know, you just sort of there were parts of the wall along the West Road that you kind of can stumble over, and that's all missed out. That you miss out on that, as well as actually Mile Castle 4, which is right in the centre of the constituency under Newcastle Newcastle Arts Centre. So you miss out on a huge part of what was the wall. And I just also say, and this is the reason why, I think it's so important, you miss out on, the wall, the beautiful countryside, Northumbrian countryside, is gorgeous, but the wall was an urban place as well. It had loads of soldiers from all over, soldiers and civilians actually, from all over the empire. It had Syrians, it had Romanians, it had Italians, obviously French. They were all stationed there. It had a thriving communities with taverns and traded goods and all that, as the archaeologists are showing. And today the West End is another thriving community with people from with a real urban feel to it, and it's also got first and second generation immigrant communities from all over the world and food from all over the world as well. And I think it actually represents what life was like relatively in Roman times there, better than certainly better than going down to the Tyne River, which wasn't actually where the wall went.
It begs the question: why has that particular section that you described so well there and so accurately, that there are real treasures? Why has it been overlooked? Why
well, you know what, that is such a good question. I mean, the fact is, so I suspect, the West Road, it's a great road. It's a contemporary road. It has, if you like, modern housing, 1930s housing, semi-detached housing, and bits of the wall are found in people's gardens in the TV show, which on archaeology. But so it's it's not pretty, and I think perhaps that was it. Perhaps I'm straight to it. Perhaps I don't think that a multicultural sort of urban environment is what they want to show tourists, and I think that's really wrong for the reasons I said. Perhaps they just thought it wasn't pretty enough. I think probably a mixture of all things, but really it's elitism, isn't it? Why are we saying that where we send tourists has to be sort of pretty and twee? Let's show them Britain as it is today, which actually reflects the wall as it was 1900 years ago.
I'm just thinking, sometimes be careful what you wish for. I'm just wondering if all the good denizens of those houses actually want lots of archaeology types appearing in their back gardens looking for bits of Hadrian's Wall.
Hey, we are a famously warm and welcoming region. I hope you've been. I hope you know that. And I was looking at your bio, and I saw that you studied archaeology. So you know about this. We're a famously warm and welcoming region. We've had archaeologists from looking at talking to residents. Yes, we want to welcome. We welcome people. We welcome visitors, appreciating our fantastic region.
You are so right. The fact that the wall is so vast. I mentioned that it's the most effort the Romans went to draw a line between themselves and others anywhere in the Roman world, and it's in beautiful countryside and all this. But you are so right that it was alive. It's so easy to overlook it as a pile of stones. And I think you're so right that reminding us that it was embedded in a community, and it was porous. Absolutely. And people moved back and forward through it, and it was where taxes were collected and customs, taken and all the rest of it. And to see it in that urban context, you're quite right. It's a different urban context, but to remind people that the wall was alive. I think
it's really interesting. That's exactly it. And also, I'll say, one of my things with historical dramas or whatever is they always look so clean, they're always like so clean and tidy, and everyone's clothes are always perfect. But actually at that time, and I'm sure Romans, they would have been dressed in different ways, and also there would have been, and one of the problems we have in the West End now, I'll tell you, is that there's people dropping litter. It's all the fast food, etc. around. But the fact that there were so many Romans dropping litter was one of the reasons why it's such an archaeological treasure trove now. Because going through like the old broken pots and whatever, is teaching us a lot about how Romans actually lived in small, like in close quarters with each other. And I just think it's really, really important and I think it's about valuing the West End of Newcastle as well, because we have this great historical monument right there, and not enough has been invested in, in archaeologists. Actually, there's lots of parts of it where we're still not entirely sure where it went. So we need to value what we can see. And then what I want is to see more archaeological investment in finding out the rest of the wall. We came across some of the oldest parts of the wall when Northumbrian Water were maintaining their drains a few months ago. They just popped up and saw like some of the oldest parts of the wall when they were doing that. So what could a proper investigation do? I really want to say that Newcastle is a Roman city as well as a great industrial city, and we celebrate that Roman part heritage. And I think the National Trail should as well. I think one of the things like Hadrian's Wall has inspired so many flights of fancy, like Game of Thrones and so much of that. But let's have the trail, reflect the actual truth, and tell people where the wall actually went. You can give people alternative routes if you want to give them choice, but tell them where the wall really went.
Benjamin, it's fascinating, isn't it, that we're even now, Hadrian's Wall, everyone's heard of it, but to realise that there's still whole chunks of it that we don't understand, that haven't been, that haven't had the attention paid to them. And I'm a great believer in if archaeological sites and historical sites have to matter, they have to matter to the people who are there now and get the lifeblood pumped back through them.
I think it's great. It reminds me of how in Rome they attempted to build new subway tunnels and they couldn't feasibly do it because they kept coming across new archaeological sites. They kept digging things up, and there's so much. You just go down a few layers and there's so much sort of actual human history, not just the Roman Empire, not the great grand monuments, but day-to-day life just buried right below your feet. But I think with the Hadrian's Wall thing, a lot of it it's the thought that counts. It's the idea of doing the trail. It isn't necessarily about always seeing the wall wherever you go. It's about remembering the fact that those people were there, that they built that wall, they conquered this island. It's more about the thought of the history. A few years ago, I wanted to do the walk, the pilgrimage from Southwark out to Canterbury Cathedral.
Okay.
And I looked up what the route would have been that Chaucer would have written about, and I found that there's about 500 different theories, 500 different routes. It's impossible to actually do the one that he would have written about because there's so many different ideas about where it would have been. And you just basically have to go with the spirit of it, not the exact route sometimes.
Although I would say that if a tourism, if you're trying to make heritage into tourism, it has to be authentic. It does have to be authentic, and I think what she's saying is that it's not authentic at the moment. Actually, if you want to see the real wall, you need to go to the west of the city, and I think that's important.
But then you say that, but when I went to Verona, they have this balcony.
Oh, I know, but sure, it's not even
Juliet's
real.
balcony, and it was put there about 200 years ago.
Yeah, it's not real.
It's not real.
No.
But everyone there was very happy.
No, they probably were.
But
I mean, if you're talking about walls, of course, the best walls of all are Derry's walls up at Londonderry. They are fabulous. They're 400 years old.
They are,
and they are extremely brilliant to visit.
They are extraordinary. I'm always impressed. Chion Wura is not an archaeologist, but she has hit the nail right on the head. The importance of remembering that these places were alive, and they were dirty, and they were in use by people going about their everyday lives, and you get a glimpse of that. She's exactly right. So thank you so much for bringing that to us, Chion Wura. And I wish you all the best with that. I think you're absolutely right. You have my backing. If the Hadrian's Wall Trail is to be authentic, it has to go through. It has to follow the wall. So you have my
Follow
backing.
the wall, all the wall. Thank you.
Exactly. Follow all the wall. There's plenty more to come on Neil Oliver Live. We have Jeff Hoon will be coming in to talk about his memoirs, and I will see you in a few minutes' time.
Looking ahead to tomorrow's weather, and the UK is looking windy, especially in the north where there'll be wintry showers. Persistent rain elsewhere. Let's take a look at the details. The day will get off to a very set start across Devon and Cornwall with heavy rain for most. Highs around 11 Celsius, but feeling colder in the wind and rain. Meanwhile, in the southeast, the rain won't be as heavy to start, but it will be cloudy and blustery and turning wet through the morning. Heavy rain across much of Wales at first. Over the hills and mountains, rainfall totals will build up, so there could be some localised impacts. It's also looking very wet in the northwest at first. The rain should gradually push away southeastwards through the morning, meaning it will turn drier. Temperatures somewhat suppressed tomorrow, but rising this week. Cold air feeding across the north means temperatures will struggle to highs of just 4 or 5 Celsius in the northeast. There'll be a few showers here and also a marked wind chill. The sleet and snow showers will continue across Scotland as we go through the morning, with some significant accumulations, mainly over higher ground, but perhaps lower levels too. In Northern Ireland, meanwhile, we should see some sunny spells. A few showers are going to come through on the brisk winds, though, and these could be a little heavy. The persistent rain will clear southeastwards throughout the morning, with sunshine showers following. The risk of snow in the north continues.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello again, this is Neil Oliver live on GB News, TV and radio. In a moment, we'll discuss the effect of lockdowns during the pandemic, but at 8 o'clock, let's get the latest news headlines from Tamsin Roberts.
Neil, thank you. Good evening from the GB newsroom. The Prime Minister has announced 2 new appointments to Downing Street after a wave of resignations this week. Cabinet Minister Steve Barclay is to become Boris Johnson's Chief of Staff, saying it's an honour to have been asked. Kit O'Harry, who was an advisor to Mr Johnson when he was Mayor of London, will become Director of Communications. The Prime Minister says the changes will strengthen his cabinet and accelerate his mission to level up the country. The announcement come as a former minister has become the latest MP to submit a letter of no confidence in Boris Johnson. Nick Gibb, who was Schools Minister last year, has joined a number of fellow Conservatives calling on the Prime Minister to resign. It's reported up to 17 MPs have now submitted letters, but a total of 54 are needed to trigger a vote of no confidence. Conservative MP for Thirsk and Malton, Kevin Hollinrake, told GB News the Prime Minister is still popular.
There's a lot of support for Boris Johnson out there. I mean, it's different in Westminster and it's different in the media, of course. But I do not think we should have a Prime Minister removed from office in this country because of a media lynch mob. I think we need to go through this process properly. I think we need to see the results of the inquiry and the investigations and make a proper decision from there.
The Duke of York is due to give evidence under oath next month as part of the ongoing civil sex assault case against him. Prince Andrew will face what is known as a deposition in London in what has been described as a neutral location. Virginia Giuffre, the Duke's accuser in the case, claims he sexually assaulted her when she was 17. The Duke strenuously denies all allegations. Boris Johnson has spoken with the French president over the tensions on the Ukraine border. Downing Street says the Prime Minister and Emmanuel Macron both agreed a diplomatic solution remains the overriding priority. The French leader will visit Moscow next week to hold discussions with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. The planned visit comes as China backed the Kremlin's demand that NATO does not allow Ukraine to join the military alliance. A new competition has been launched by the government to find the new home of the railways. The winning town or city, which has to be outside London, will house the new Great British Railways headquarters. Transport Secretary Grant Shapps says it should be somewhere well connected and with a great railway history. The winner will be announced this summer. And the Queen has hosted a reception in Sandringham for members of the local community as part of celebrations to mark her Platinum Jubilee. The 95-year-old monarch welcomed guests, including former cookery student Angela Wood, who helped invent the famous dish Coronation Chicken. It was served to guests after the Queen's coronation in 1953. Well, today, Her Majesty also cut a sponge cake decorated with the Platinum Jubilee logo. This is GB News on TV, online and DAB Plus radio. Now, let's get back to Neil Oliver Live.
Welcome back. A report by economists at Johns Hopkins University has found that lockdowns in Europe and the US lessened the COVID-19 mortality rate by just 0.2%. The authors also concluded that everywhere lockdowns were applied, they caused enormous economic and social costs and were therefore to be regarded as ill-founded and should be rejected in future. It's fair to say at the very least that lockdowns were a controversial tactic, and opinions on both sides of the debate have been running hot almost since the beginning. With me now to open up a wider debate is Richard Tice, leader of Reform UK. Hello,
Good evening, Neil. Good evening. I mean, this report to me wasn't a surprise. I was one of the early people worrying and talking about the collateral damage of lockdowns, and that there were so many other things to think about. But what you're seeing from that 0.2%, I mean, you can't measure things that closely. So the reality is that this is within the margin of error. And when you look at some of the other costs, the 70,000+ people who died, excess deaths at home in those first few months, and you think, goodness me, I mean, didn't our leaders get this catastrophically wrong?
And of course, a problem there, I don't think really that because of the determination to keep everything about COVID and people dying as a result or with or of, that other deaths were being overlooked.
Yes.
Well, we will never know, is my suspicion. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but while we know in general that there's been a big hit, a big hurt, we won't be able to measure it because the data wasn't being collected.
The data wasn't being collected, but what we do know is that excess deaths at home were huge, and some really morbid. The number of badly decomposed bodies that were found weeks later, having been left alone, was way, way above previous years. And that tells you something. That really tells you the number of people who suffered at home in real suffering, real pain, agony, and then tragically may well have died because they thought they were doing the right thing to protect the NHS. And because of this total sole focus on COVID. And I think we've just got to be brave enough to say horrendous mistakes were made. We have to be brave enough to learn from them. But our leaders at the time, they're the ones who've really got to accept they got some stuff wrong. And at the moment, I worry that we're not seeing that.
We were discussing earlier that we were all agreed that there was a period in the beginning where we were all anxious or scared, or a combination of both. But the problem was that it was then drawn out. We went out of that period of not knowing into knowing, and we knew that it was different than had been first been feared, but there didn't seem to be a change in the response. But my question is, we know that unprecedented though the pandemic was for our generation, the World Health Organization had suggested that when it came to a pandemic, should there be one, that quarantining the healthy, because there was no such word as lockdown, I don't think, quarantining the healthy was a bad idea, and that pandemic plans across Europe, here as well, were broadly similar and were quite simple. It was targeted help for the vulnerable and washing hands, but not locking down. Why do you think, why were all of those plans cast aside and a Chinese model followed?
I think actually a total failure of courageous leadership at the first sign of what turned out to be some more, yet further, appalling modelling that came out of the likes of Neil Ferguson and out of Imperial College. I was really struck by an article by Fraser Nelson in The Telegraph the other day, and he said, emails have now come out from health officials in Sweden, and when they saw that it was Neil Ferguson making these forecasts, they said, don't listen to what he did because of his woeful track record on things like swine flu. And so they actually had the confidence to stick to their own. And we know the WHO guidance beforehand was exactly as you said, remarkably similar to actually what the Great Barrington Declaration that was launched in October 20 said. And yet, those of us that tried to advocate that in those early months, I mean, the pain and the smears and the attacks that we got was awful. It really was. I mean, it's just...
Arlene, can you speak to that? You know, in the position that you occupied, why there was a plan, and furthermore, that plan was the same plan as everyone else's. So there was a sort of broad consensus, you would say, and it was backed up by WHO advice. Why did they fall like dominoes all across the European continent and be replaced by something else?
I think from the UK's perspective, of course, we were behind other countries, like Italy, of course, and when we saw what was happening in Italy, the fear that was there at that particular point in time was incredible. And so when Italy started to lock down people, it was almost like groupthink had taken over then. So if they're doing it, we must do it. And as I've explained, Richard, earlier on in the show, in the Northern Ireland Executive, you have everybody from way left of centre to right of centre, and the decision has to be taken by everybody. And when we started to ask, well, is this proportionate when you take into account the economic harm, the harms that are happening in other areas of health, such as cancer diagnoses and things like that, we were seen to be some sort of killers. I mean, the amount of attention that we got, I remember having a discussion about trying to keep coffee shops open for a week longer than the others wanted. And I mean, the opprobrium that we got was just incredible. And history was going to judge us and all this sort of thing. So it is very difficult, and as it happened, because the executive had to take that decision together, we couldn't go against that. But what I'm saying to you is, you're saying that it's a failure of leadership, but when the leaders are being told by their health advisors and that this is going to happen, the modelling is there, so many people are going to die if you don't lock down and take these actions, it is a very difficult call to make.
Which is why I use the word courageous, because it is, without question, a very difficult call to make. And unprecedented. And in a sense, I can sort of understand why people ended there, and I think those circumstances you've just described, Eileen, are particularly sort of special to Northern Ireland.
Yes, they are,
But what really struck me after about 3 weeks was the absolute refusal of any minister in any of those daily press conferences in Downing Street to even consider post-lockdown planning, whether there was anybody looking at that. No, can't look at that, just stay at home, save lives, protect the NHS.
But Richard, do you not remember those conferences as well? All of the media, all they wanted to know was, you should be locking down quicker. Why are we not doing things quicker? I mean, and there was no counter-narrative at all.
There was no counter-narrative at all.
None.
And the lack of context and discussion, and I think the media has a huge role, a huge element of the blame here, in that there was no contextual discussion. There was no discussion or questioning from the media to the minister saying, look, what's happening to cancer treatments or cardiac treatments or anybody else with other serious illnesses? And I'm not a doctor, I'm not a medic, but it was pretty obvious to me that there was going to be some serious collateral damage.
Benjamin, were you surprised by that? Arlene mentioned the one-sidedness of the media response, which was just to demand harder, faster, longer, more. Were you surprised by that?
On the one hand, it was one-sided, but on the other hand, there were people coming out saying this, but they were immediately regarded as being in some way extreme, far beyond the pale. And it's the same thing with doctors. You know, you get perfectly respected doctors who are very well experienced. They've got years and years. They've been doctors specialising in certain areas, and no one's ever questioned their credentials until they questioned maybe the pandemic isn't quite as bad as to suggest that we need this particular response, or maybe that this particular response means that you get more deaths from cancer, missed cancer screenings, and mental health related issues, and so on and so forth. But those people were immediately sidelined. They were called extremists, and they were cast out of polite society. Who's doing this?
Because there was only one science. You had to follow the science.
The science, yeah.
And we all know that actually the reason science progresses is because different great scientists challenge each other.
Exactly.
And they push each other, and they test each other.
The principle of the scientific method is that you don't come up with a theory and then try to prove it. You come up with a theory and then try to disprove it. No one tried to disprove lockdown or the perceived notion of what COVID was. No one attempted to disprove it. They just tried to prove it.
And those of us that did try to challenge it, it was so painful.
Yeah.
We sort of retreated below the parapet.
Indeed.
But what I continue to not understand was why the fear of the virus itself prevailed for so long. Because it was apparent, if you cared to look, that the numbers weren't there. You know, that I didn't know anyone, and still don't know anyone who died of COVID, not directly. And I wondered at the fact that because we had been told in the first couple of weeks to expect, bodies piling up in the street, it quickly became apparent that it wasn't like that. But somehow or other, the fear maintained and prevailed, and it felt as though it was being deliberately stoked, that once that fire was lit, it was beneficial for some reason that wasn't just about COVID.
But of course, you've just used a critical word, died of COVID, as opposed to died with COVID.
Oh, yes.
There was no context, there was no reminder that the average number of deaths every day in the UK is about 1,650. It's a lot more in the winter, it's a bit less in the summer. So there was no context there. And we've heard subsequently so many people whose deaths, on the death certificate, it said COVID as the primary source, when actually, their family and loved ones know full well it was nothing to do with COVID. So we may well have massively exaggerated the COVID-related deaths. And I think that was part of the fear thing. And I don't understand that as to what was the incentive. Were hospitals paid more if it was a COVID-related death? Were GPs paid more if they were signing a COVID-related certificate? I'm still not clear about that. I hear all sorts of stuff. I think we've just got to now be brave enough to learn these lessons and to say, look, we got some stuff right, we got some stuff wrong. We must make sure we learn the lessons in the future and never make those mistakes again. That's how you make progress. I'm concerned there's still not that willingness to learn lessons. I'm also concerned there's no discussion about the public inquiry going on at the moment. No discussion at all.
It's gone completely off the agenda.
So
I don't know where it is.
There's no terms of reference.
Yeah.
There's no suggested panellists. I have to say, everybody, I don't think it'll happen.
No,
I certainly don't think it'll happen this side of a general election. There are too many people with too many vested interests to protect and careers to protect. Not only the politicians, but some of the senior people in SAGE, the senior medical advisors.
I think if it does happen, it will be the equivalent of the Sue Gray report, where it will be an exoneration, not an investigation.
The questions that you were asking, where you were saying, as I have done, I see things, online and elsewhere, speculating about, was it about money and were there inducements to report COVID deaths for whatever reason? Those kinds of ideas are inevitably what gets sucked into the vacuum that was left, that was created for want of reasoned debate. Because we couldn't discuss at all, into that void was pulled all manner of speculative material. But when it comes to, for example, that Johns Hopkins report, which it ought to be, I think that ought to be, front page news across the board. It's so revealing and damning. But I get the continued sense that it'll still be just quietly, acknowledged and barely.
But the reality is, it is too damning. And I think it's just too difficult for some of the leaders at the time to admit, to have the courage to admit, look, this was unprecedented. We got some stuff wrong. Maybe we didn't learn fast enough. But as we look back, we've got to be honest with ourselves. And I think it's a real problem with politics today. It's why we've got the pickle in Downing Street and all around, all that other unrelated stuff. But that unwillingness to admit mistakes.
Why is it so hard? When did the willingness to acknowledge a mistake become so toxic? I always remember that, apparently when Albert Einstein would take a new post somewhere and they would ask him what he wanted, he would say a very big waste paper basket into which I can throw all my mistakes. And he was lauded for the fact that he was open to being wrong. And I think there's something incredibly noble, and I personally would welcome a politician who would stand up and say, do you know, I've had another look at this and I was wrong.
So extraordinary. So I think our media is partly to blame. But interestingly, just this week, there was a real moment when none other than Michael Gove on another station
Yes, he did.
did actually admit totally openly that before Christmas, he looked at the data, he made his recommendation to Cabinet, and the judgment was different, and he said, I was wrong, he got it wrong. And actually, I think we welcome that. I think the public welcome that. They appreciate that honesty.
100%.
And look, none of us get everything right. The key thing is to learn from your mistakes and try not to make them again. We do it in business, and the more we try and do that in politics, and the more we're honest with the public, with everybody, I think the more respect we'll get, and maybe that will help build trust in politicians.
Do you really think is there any sign that lessons have been learned?
At the moment, I can't really say I can. I would like to feel differently, but I think there are probably more of us now. If this happened again in a year's time, if there's another big variant, I think there would be more now who would be more questioning in the media, in all the various sort of commentators and things. And I think more of the public would be questioning and would look to other success stories, the Swedens, the Japans of this world, and say, actually, and what was really interesting in those couple of weeks before Christmas, actually, we did change our behaviour.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I think the turning point was that vote when the backbenchers rebelled and forced Boris Johnson to do what he did before Christmas, which of course was different in Scotland and Northern Ireland, as we know. But here, he made the right call. And Michael Gove has acknowledged that. You're absolutely right. He was for locking down at that time, but
I just wonder that it's moved out of the realm of what the politicians do. You know, the mask wearing, for example, which has always been, personally, it's always been a big bugbear for me. I spend most of my time in Scotland, and the extent to which masks are ingrained now, people wearing them alone on the street, alone driving in their cars, and the extent to which they seem to have become uniform symbols of something else that is no longer anything to do with preventing the spread of a virus. I don't know how we get beyond it. I genuinely don't. I think some people intend to wear masks forever.
And ultimately, that's personal choice. But the tragedy is that it's been driven by fear. And running a nation, running a people by fear, that is statist, that is bordering on some form of communist-style control.
Well, you used the right word, communist. It's not just fear, it's collectivist. It's the idea of wearing a mask. It's saying we are part of one together. The people who aren't wearing them, they're your enemy. They're the people who are going to infect you, and they're outside of our in-group. It's a collectivist mentality. It's not just fear, it's communism.
And of course, as you've spoken so eloquently in the past, Neil, the greatest damage is to young people and children in all sorts of ways. And, you know, the stories I hear from nursery groups where 3-year-olds are way behind in their speech development because they didn't get out, they were wearing masks, their parents were wearing masks, their nursery wearing masks, and you think, you know, we've no idea where this starts and finishes.
The biggest problem, as I understand it, that educationalists have in the early years is that it's children coming who have problems with speech and problems with hearing. That's just the most common obstacle that has to be overcome in nursery and primary school. It's kids with, you know, that need some kind of support and help with that. And their teachers are masked and they're masked and their fellow their fellow the children around them are masked as well. And what we have sown for the future is yet to be weighed.
And let's remember, at the beginning of the pandemic, there were lots of people saying, should we wear a mask? And we were told by the scientific leaders at the time, no, they don't need to wear masks. The likes of Van Tam and Jenny Harris and co, you don't need to wear masks. And Anthony Fauci over in the States. And then months later, it becomes absolutely mandatory. And if you're not wearing a mask, you're a selfish denier. Hang on, folks. I mean, where's the consistency here?
Yeah. This is a conversation that will go on and on. Thank you, Richard.
Indeed.
It's great to see
Lovely
you.
to
Thanks
see you.
for coming in and being with us to talk about that face-to-face. After the break, former Labour Defence Secretary Geoff Hoon joins us.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask. So why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello again. Now, Geoff Hoon was a cabinet minister under both Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. For nearly 6 years, he was Defence Secretary, overseeing events in Sierra Leone, Afghanistan and Iraq. Now he has published his memoirs, described as an indispensable insider's account of New Labour. See how they run. There's the cover there. Details his start in life in a small East Midlands town, and how life took him to a long political career, during which he was also Leader of the House of Commons, Government Chief Whip, Secretary of State for Transport and Minister for Europe. Mr Hoon joins me now. Hello, Mr Hoon.
Good evening, how are you?
I'm very well. I think I'm going to call it an autobiography, memoirs. I'm not sure how you characterise it, but how does a person decide that the time has come to reflect and to produce a memoir? What was the trigger?
I think that's a very good question. I suspect lots and lots of people have books that they are planning to write and somehow never quite get around to them. And in my case, I think fairly straightforwardly, it was the lockdown, amount of time that I had available, and the fact that I needed to get on and do what I'd always thought I would like. I suspect that publishers have been inundated with manuscripts from people who had always promised that they would write a book and finally got around to it because they actually had the time. So that was really the motivation, if you like.
I was fascinated to read about your young life, the stories about your dad and his time in the RAF, and I wonder if you would just recount for us, the anecdote is possibly the wrong word, but the treatment that your dad watched being meted out to a neighbour and intervened to stop, I found very affecting. I wondered if you could summarise that for us.
Yeah, sure. I grew up on an estate, and in those days, many years ago, we could play football across the road. So few cars. Down there, we were a gang of kids from the estate were playing football, and across the road, a man who really didn't participate in the affairs of the street. Unfortunately, some of the kids were making fun of him, and at that point, my dad came flying out of the house, pretty much picked me up, actually, took me inside and made quite clear that I would have some difficulty sitting down if I was part of that. Fortunately, I hadn't been. Went on to explain that Anne had been a prisoner of the Japanese in the World War. My dad served in India, the invasion of Japan. So, although he hadn't suffered in the way that man had, he'd seen some of the victims of what had happened on the railway and in the camps, and rightly was furious that this man was being made fun of.
Yes, it was very moving. I was very touched by how you described that he had given a presentation in front of an audience in a school, and had described that it was coming back into the hut at night and seeing an orchid through a crack in the wall, and that if he could come in every night and see that the orchid was still alive and still growing, that gave him just enough to stay alive.
And that story was he taught something local school, and a new head teacher had decided that all of the members of staff had to do the morning assembly, and some of the older, perhaps more experienced teachers said, look, this man really shouldn't be required to do that. It's just not him. He will not be able to survive in front of hundreds of young people. And initially that seemed to be the case when the head teacher insisted. And he stood there for a while, and the pupils were getting very restless and beginning to make a noise. But then gradually he began to talk, and he described his experience on the railway in one of these camps. And as you say, what kept him alive, he said, was being able to see each day through a crack in the wooden hut this orchid that was gradually growing. And every other man in the hut died, but that kept him alive, he said. And after his very early death, the school actually bought some orchids and put them in a greenhouse. And as far as I'm aware, they're still there to this day. But I think it's a remarkable story about what my dad's generation went through. I was born towards the end of 1953, and my generation did not have that experience. They heard their parents talking about the war and what it was like. But I think we were a very fortunate generation in missing that.
Now, when it comes to your time, I wanted to hear you talk about that to get us into your time as Defence Secretary. And in particular, of course, I'm very interested to hear what you made of the US and indeed our withdrawal from Afghanistan around the time of the anniversary of 9/11. I wondered how you interpreted how that was done.
Well, it was deeply disappointing. I don't think anybody can pretend otherwise. I was involved in the initial decision to send British troops in support of the Americans to Afghanistan. And bear in mind, at the time, after 9/11, the whole world wanted to help out. I spent Christmas 2001 pretty much constantly on the telephone to defence secretaries, to prime ministers, to presidents, all wanting to send troops to Afghanistan to help the Americans to, in a sense, try and right the wrong of 9/11. So there was worldwide support for that initial action. The problem was, of course, and we all saw those terrible pictures last summer, that although the Americans were ultimately successful in hitting back at Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, the reality was that despite the sacrifices that were made over 20 years, we were never able to rebuild the country in a sustainable way, in a way that would preserve the changes that have been made, but carried out by Afghan people rather than by the presence of foreign soldiers, which are always going to be a difficulty for many parts of Afghan society. And that really was the tragedy of what happened last summer.
You describe also that before 9/11 you were aware of Al-Qaeda and the fact that they had been a looming threat for a long time before the atrocity of 9/11. And I just wonder if you could, describe how you felt. And I think we've lost them just at the. Arlene, memoirs. Are we there for you yet?
No, not yet. I'm much too young, Neil, to be writing memoirs. A lot of people have asked me, am I going to, as the first female First Minister of Northern Ireland, to write my memoirs? And I probably will at some stage, but I'm much too busy on GB News at the moment to be doing that.
Not quite yet. Have we got? Is Jeff back with us? Jeff, if I could move on to that. I think it was a section in the book that got quite a bit of coverage in the press when you describe how Tony Blair's Chief of Staff told you to burn a memo from the Attorney General that cast doubt on whether our involvement in the Iraq War was legal. Could you elaborate on that fascinating sequence of events?
Well, I wasn't actually party to that conversation. It was a conversation between my principal private secretary and the Chief of Staff in Downing Street. There had been some considerable problem inside the MOD for a while in that the military required, understandably and correctly, a very clear legal opinion saying that it would be lawful for us to commit British soldiers into Iraq. British soldiers are subject to the same law that you and I are subject to, and therefore have to behave lawfully in whatever action they take. So it was quite right that the Chiefs of Defence Staff wanted that information and wanted that very clearly set out. I was sent a very long and very complicated legal document, and fortunately I'm a lawyer, so I guess I was able to understand the complexities. What he didn't really do was give a very definitive answer, and it was also circulated very tightly, and I wasn't even supposed to discuss it with anyone else, which is quite a problem if you're trying to justify taking military action. And as I understand the conversation, my principal private secretary asked what he should do with this document after I'd read it. In no uncertain terms, he was told to destroy it. Well, my principal private secretary discussed that with me, and we felt it wouldn't be appropriate to destroy it. We put it in a safe, and to the best of my knowledge, it could still be there to this day. But it was simply one of the tensions that built up, obviously, as we got near to military action in Iraq.
Am I right in thinking that you describe how it was an almost impenetrable legal document, difficult even for a legal mind to consider, but that it seemed to boil down to something relatively simple, which was that the Attorney General was saying that our involvement in Iraq with America would only be legal if the Prime Minister decided that, in his opinion, it was in the national interests so to do. Would that be right? Was that the distillation?
I think the only would quibble with your formulation is the word only. This was a very long, very detailed document looking at all of the various ways in which legal action could be justified, and equally looking at some of the ways in which it might prove more difficult. So it was a very, very comprehensive, it was a very impressive piece of work, actually, to the legal mind. What he didn't do was set out very specifically a legal basis for taking action other than the one that you have correctly described.
But I must admit, I was caught by that, the idea that when push comes to shove in a situation, that a Prime Minister can take action if he or she believes that it's in the national interest. It sounds as though a Prime Minister's opinion trumps the law.
I don't agree with that, and bear in mind, this was part of a legal process, and I'm not suggesting this was the last word or the only word. There were further legal opinions supplied in the light of changing circumstances, changing information from the United States. So this was, to the best of my recollection, the first that I saw from the Attorney General. There were further versions, iterations, if you like, all gone through in some considerable detail in the Chilcot inquiry. So this was the starting point, but as I say, a very complicated starting point as far as I was concerned.
In light of the criticism that there has been of Mr. Blair's knighthood, and this revelation about the instruction to burn the memo has been fuel for those opposed to that honour for Mr. Blair. Do you think that it has, that the story that you had to tell has a bearing on whether or not his knighthood is appropriate?
Well, I certainly think it's appropriate. I have absolutely no difficulty in believing that former Prime Minister, especially one who Prime Minister as long as he was and faced the challenges that he faced and generally speaking, led an extremely successful government. So I can't think that it would be appropriate to prevent Her Majesty from granting that honour, not least because I know from my time in the Ministry of Defence, very many senior generals, admirals, chiefs of the air staff are automatically ennobled or given titles. Similarly, senior civil servants are knighted. So I don't have any difficulty with the fact that Tony Blair, who was arguably the most successful Labour Prime Minister in history, should receive that honour. I think he thoroughly deserves it.
Something else interesting that I picked up on in my reading, you suggest that where Gordon Brown was fiercely loyal to those around him, to his team, and would go into bat whenever he felt that they were being, unduly challenged or threatened. But on the contrary, you seem to interpret Mr. Blair as tending to overlook those who supported him while promoting those who were less supportive of where he wanted to take the country. That's a very interesting character trait. And I loved when you said as well that you had been described in a profile somewhere as being Blairite before Tony Blair was leader of the Labour Party. But I wonder how you felt about that those that were keen to support him would perhaps take for granted while seeking to offer advancement to those who didn't.
That was certainly my consistent impression from quite early on. And in truth, I've never understood why that was the case. You'd have to have Tony Blair on your programme to answer that question. I simply do not know the answer. But certainly you're quite right that Gordon Brown was fiercely loyal to his team, to his supporters, and ensured that they were looked after and promoted at every opportunity. And simply, I guess I write about it because that was something that was true, in my experience, right through their respective leaderships of the Labour Party and being Prime Minister.
Mr. Hoon, it's a fascinating read. I've got it here. I've got my copy. If you're ever in the studio with me, you can possibly autograph it for me. I found it right enough. It is a fascinating insight to the life and times of New Labour. Thank you very much for being with us tonight to give us that inside track. It's fascinating stuff, isn't it? That insight about Tony Blair being tending to take people for granted if they were on his team and being attracted to bringing on and advancing those who opposed them.
No, it's fascinating. I think that's a really good thing, though, because, at the moment, I think Boris values people who are loyal to him or not a threat to him. It seems that Blair, for all his faults, actually valued people who challenged him. I think you're a better leader if you're challenged constantly than if you surround yourself with yes-men and sycophants.
Would you interpret that the same way?
Well, I think that is right. It is important when you're a leader. Being a leader, and I remember my predecessor saying this to me, being a leader is a very lonely place. So you actually need people who are going to be honest with you and are not telling you something you want to hear, but are actually going to tell you the hard truths you know?
It's not just in leadership, it's in life.
Well, it's in life, but I think...
challenge it.
Yeah, you need people who'll say, do you think that's the right thing to do? Because I don't think it's the right thing to do. You know, and I mean, that's a difficult thing to do when you're challenging a leader. And I have to say, I always respected people who would do that more so than people who would just tell you what they thought you wanted to hear.
And do you think Benjamin's right in his assessment of Boris? Do you think there has been a tendency for Boris to coddle people who tell him what he wants to hear?
Yeah, but I noticed that he's bringing in people from City Hall again. Geeta Harry's back in Downing Street. So he'll want people who he feels he can trust now in Downing Street. That's certainly what he needs. He needs people there. But he also needs people who are going to tell him and give him advice, because some of the advice he's been given recently is clearly not working out very well.
Yeah.
What was your reaction, while I have you here, to the way we withdrew from Afghanistan? What was your gut reaction to that?
We covered it extensively on the programmes that I am involved with here. I found it very, very difficult, because what we had done, particularly for women and girls in Afghanistan, was we had allowed them to see what their life could be like, and now we've taken that away from them. And when you see what's actually happening in Afghanistan now, some 5-6 months on from the withdrawal, people are selling their kidneys, people are starving. It's an awful, awful place, and that is the legacy of the way in which we left Afghanistan. Interesting to hear Jeff Hoon talk about the fact that they wanted to try and change Afghanistan and to give them strength to be able to look after themselves, and that didn't happen. I always felt that if we'd left a smaller force in Afghanistan to support the Afghanis, it would have been the right thing to do. There was no need to have a huge force in Afghanistan. But I think the way in which we left, it was like Vietnam. It was a terrible, terrible indictment of American foreign policy, and then, of course, we had to go as well. And it was awful the way it was dealt with.
Benjamin, I don't think I've ever been more depressed than I was watching that withdrawal. That was my reaction. It was just so flatteningly sad, and it seemed so unavoidably obvious that what has unfolded in the months since was going to unfold.
And I think it was a long time coming. I think we need to reassess the way that we intervene in foreign conflicts, because if we don't have the strength to sustain the sort of new regime we put into place, then we shouldn't get involved in the first place. If we go in, we need to understand what our limitations are. It's, you know, we go in very gung-ho saying we're going to throw out this old regime, put into place a new one, but then you end up spending loads of money and resources on these projects which were just absolutely farcical. They were I think we spent millions on a gender studies programme for a university in Afghanistan. You don't run before you can walk. Yes. You need to establish the most important things first. Democracy, the fundamental rule of law. Those are the things that are the most important. And when you go into all of these silly programmes throwing money and resources into it, it's all going to come tumbling down. And unless we have a plan going in the first place, we just shouldn't go in at all.
But you're so right, Arlene, that idea of dangling in front of people what the world could be, only to actually, not just to leave it behind, but to take it away from them.
Yeah.
I think that was what was so heart-rending. Yeah. Moving on, though, after the break, we will discuss the controversy surrounding comedian Jimmy Carr.
On Mark Dolan tonight, Jamaican bobsleigh legend Devon Harris, the man whose story inspired the hit Hollywood film Cool Runnings, is my Mark Meets guest. Hear his incredible and inspiring story at 10. In The Big Question, should comedy be censored following Jimmy Carr's recent Netflix show? We've got news on a breakthrough to cure baldness, plus ex-Lib Dem MP Lembit Opik is part of my panel. And in my big opinion, when are the media going to apologise for getting COVID so wrong? See you at 9.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back. As promised, we can have a look at some of the feedback that's been coming in via social media. JB says, another spot-on monologue. You're brave and compassionate. Thank you for keeping me and Mr. B sane. I think that might have been from my mum. Derek Jacobs says, Neil, the mistake was to count data. It should have been counting bodies, full stop. Christine Easdale says, the one question you're not asking is why governments behaved like this. Why did they ruin the economy? What is the agenda? On another topic entirely, Jenny says, Dear Neil, I was abused as a young child and teenager. I'm 51 years old now, and I've had lots of counselling over the years. I know logically that it was never my fault, but the psychological scars remain, and there's still a part of my mind that sometimes ponders the question, was any of it my fault? These wounds remain forever. The best we can hope for is that the feelings of shame are infrequent and that the periods in between are a little lighter every time. I love your show so very much. Well, thank you for being in touch, Jenny, and I wish you all the very best. The Winter Olympics kicked off yesterday in Beijing with a fireworks-filled opening ceremony and with some encouraging results already in events like the curling. Team GB are setting their eyes on Olympic gold. Our reporter, Anna Riley, spoke to Team GB snowboarder Katie Ormerod about her hopes for the competition and the trials she had to overcome along the way.
Team GB Olympian Katie Ormerod is rearing to hit the snow in Beijing and win a title for her country. But it's been a slippery slope to get there. Just 3 days before the 2018 Winter Olympics, Katie fractured her heel training, with the injury nearly ending her career. But after 7 operations, skin grafts and a full year of arduous rehab, Katie's back in winning form, becoming the first Briton to win a World Cup snowboard title in 2020. The 24-year-old hopes that all her hard work will finally pay off for these Olympic Games.
An Olympic medal would feel amazing. Yeah, it is obviously a dream of mine, but I think because of how badly Pyeongchang went and the fact that, you know, I had to overcome so much from getting over my broken heel, and it was really close to being career ending. So the fact that I'm now going into a second Olympic Games, like that to me is just the most amazing thing. And I've been working really hard over the last few years to be in a position where, you know, I can hopefully go and do well and, you know, hopefully get a medal. But I'm not really going in with that mindset. I'm just going in hoping to do the best that I can possibly do on the day. And if I do that, you know, I can't ask for any more of myself, and hopefully a result will come with that.
Katie first learnt to snowboard when she was 5 years old and loves the freedom that flying through the air gives her. She's proud of her Yorkshire roots and how she can match herself against competitors who grew up surrounded by mountains.
I'm so proud to be from Yorkshire, and yeah, I'm really like it's just such an amazing feeling being able to represent, you know, my country in snowboarding, because, you know, we're not known for being like a winter sport nation, and I've had to work so hard to, you know, get to this position now where I'm going into my second Olympic Games in a winter sport. You know, I've had to work so much harder than the people I compete against who grew up in the mountains, and I'm really proud of that. And, you know, I'm hoping that I can inspire a lot of other British people as well, that, you know, you can achieve anything you want if you put your mind to it. And just because, you know, we don't have ski resorts all over where we live, and you can still, you know, get to the top level if you work hard at it.
While she may have been in great shape in 2018, the 2022 Games could be about to see the best version of Katie Ormerod yet, with a potential medal on the horizon for this West Yorkshire snowboarder. Anna Riley, GB News.
That frightens the living daylights out of me. How anyone gets psyched up to do that, I really don't know. Now, Jimmy Carr, never one to shy away from making light of sensitive subjects, has been criticised once again for a routine in his stand-up show with Netflix called His Dark Material. The joke was aimed at the travelling community and the hundreds of thousands who died during the Holocaust. Among the critics are MPs, charity, friends, families and travellers, and the Holocaust Educational Trust. Benjamin, how do you react to what he said and the response to what he said?
Well, I think the joke, in general, with offensive jokes, the way that I look at it, there's a certain calculus. If it's less funny than it is offensive, then it's not acceptable in a sense that it comes off cruel-hearted and wrong and all the rest of it. If it's funny and it's genuinely not a joke about at the expense of the people you're offending or who are the subject of it, then I can see why, you know, some of this might be seen as being a bit of an overreaction. In the case of this particular joke, when you look at the mechanics of the joke, it's a misdirection joke. He's making a joke about the fact that people never focus on the fact that 500,000 gypsies died. They always focus on one area of the Holocaust and not the other area. Leading into that, you think he's saying, oh, these people are overlooked. He then subverts expectations and says it's a good thing, not a bad thing. That was the idea of the joke. People who are getting offended about this, I find, tend to not have watched the special, not have understood the joke, not even have seen the clip. They're jumping on a bandwagon quite often. However, I actually don't think the joke was funny. I don't think it was as funny as it was offensive. I don't think he should have said it. But I do defend his right to say it. I believe in free speech. But the one caveat I'll say is that he has to say that joke every time he tells it to Tyson Fury's face and see what happens.
What an excellent point, well made.
I think that'd be I think that's the end of the joke.
That's a show right there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Arlene, how do you, this joke in particular, but comedy in general, I would say up front, I just think a joke's a joke. You find it funny, you don't. You find it offensive, you don't find it offensive. You can choose whether or not to go and see a given.
Yeah, well, that's the way I look at it. Look, I think it is offensive. I think it's offensive, and you can see from the list of people who have been outraged about it. But that doesn't mean to say he doesn't have a right to say it. I mean, I have long campaigned about online safety, for example, because when people make death threats against you online, I think action should be taken. Now, I know that there are some people who say, no, freedom of speech, blah, blah, blah. I actually think you have to draw a line when you start making threats to people, and that's when the action comes in. But if you're just saying, I don't like you, if you say something other than that that's offensive, but actually doesn't threaten you, then people have the right to say that, you know, so they can say about your appearance or whatever.
The way things have gone, I find if it's a binary choice between people being allowed to say anything, literally anything, or moving towards a world where we get handed a laminated sheet at birth of the things we can say and nothing else, I'm going to have to go with anyone can say anything, however offensive.
Yeah, and
even if it's a death threat.
Well, if it's a binary choice, I think I would just. There are laws in place about, you know, inciting violence, but I worry very much that this is beginning to just fundamentally erode freedom of speech.
One of the new sort of faddish things around this, the sort of compromise between free speech and consequences of free speech, is the idea of a content warning. And I think the name His Dark Material is a content warning.
Running out of time. Thank you so much. That's all from me and Neil Oliver Live. Martin Holland is coming up next. Thank you so much, Arlene, Benjamin, your contributions were perfect, and thank you for being my companions for 2 hours. Lovely.
Looking ahead to tomorrow's weather, and the UK is looking windy, especially in the north, where there'll be wintry showers. Persistent rain elsewhere. Let's take a look at the details. The day will get off to a very set start across Devon and Cornwall, with heavy rain for most. Highs around 11 Celsius, but feeling colder in the wind and rain. Meanwhile, in the southeast, the rain won't be as heavy to start, but it will be cloudy and blustery and turning wet through the morning. Heavy rain across much of Wales at first. Over the hills and mountains, rainfall totals will build up, so there could be some localised impacts. It's also looking very wet in the northwest at first. The rain